Women and Religion in the Classical Polis. In one Greek tragedy, a chorus of Greek women held captive by barbarians in Tauris, now Sebastopol in Crimea, nostalgically sing of how much they desired to return to their various Greek cities. I wish I could travel in the bright pathways of the horse-drawn chariot of the fiery sun. I wish I could hover, the wings on my back held still, over the rooms of my home. I wish I could take my place in choruses, where once, in my mother's presence, I danced as a girl with twirling feet, in ensembles with my age group, rivals in grace in soft, expensive clothes. I prepared for the contest by dressing in embroidered robes and braids that cast shadows on my cheeks. One of the greatest pleasures for ancient Greek women was their participation, alongside other women of all generations, in religious cults, festivals and ritual. It was also one of the areas in which they found the greatest freedom of action and freedom of self-expression. It was also an area in which, as high priestesses in crucial cults and escorts of both women and men across the great ritual thresholds that frame human life, birth, initiation into adulthood, marriage and death, they won great respect equal to that paid to men. The prominence of women in ancient Greek religion certainly went all the way back to the late Bronze Age Mycenaean civilization. The Linear B texts, as well as the visual art, reveal women not only as animate votive offerings to the gods, but as priestesses, key bearers, cup bearers, perhaps performing duties at sacrificial meals. The last 40 years have seen a welcome revision of ancient social and intellectual history in the light of feminism. And one important focus has been on the frequent near total exclusion of women from most institutional forms of power: civic, administrative, political, legal and economic. In most Greek city-states, women couldn't vote, they couldn't stand for public office, speak in public on matters other than religion, exert control over their own finances, or even represent themselves in court. Yet in one of the most important arenas of social life, which intersected with both political and private life, and that's religion, women had so much more power, influence and fun than in any of the great monotheisms. I've always envied them sorely. As the daughter of an Anglican priest, I was brought up in the knowledge that my bodily impurity as a woman excluded me from performing in the choir and certainly from being ordained into the priesthood. Her very best hope was one day to be a bridesmaid. Greek women, in contrast, not only sang and danced in ritual choruses on numerous festival days a year, their hair beautifully coiffed in their best costumes, but they celebrated raucous women-only festivals in honour of the impressive group of Olympian goddesses. Each one represented a department of female in experience and competence. Hera was goddess of women's social status, in charge of the respect due to wives. Aphrodite, goddess of erotic love and the immense value attached by the ancient Greeks to beauty, desire and sexual fulfilment. Athena was goddess of handicraft, textile production, intelligent forethought and protection of citadels. Artemis was goddess of girls' physical bodies and female biological transitions, birth, menarche and death. Demeter and Persephone, fertility goddesses whose intense mother-daughter bond finds no remote equivalent in the whole of Christian mythology. Greek religion was complicated. It differed between cities, and each city had its own favoured gods, such as Athena in Athens and Hera in Argos. By reason of accidents of transmission for the classical period, so approximately 500 to 320 BCE, we have far more evidence for Athens than for any other city. And in the second half of this lecture, I will focus on Athenian women. But first, let's survey the role of women in some Panhellenic cults, that is, cults practiced across the entire Greek-speaking world, and some interesting examples of non-Athenian local cults which we're lucky enough to know something about. So, Panhellenic cults. Greek identity became consolidated during the Archaic period. at the shared sanctuaries to which the Greeks travelled to meet each other in their swift black ships. It's from the 8th century that much of the earliest evident dates for the worship of Greek gods in many other sanctuaries, always open-air spaces marked off as sacred with low walls or rows of stone and an altar on which to burn offerings. A few sanctuaries were truly Panhellenic in that they belonged to all the Hellenes in a neutral space. Zeus, the supreme god of the Greek pantheon, presided over several key sanctuaries of all the Greeks. At Dodona, for example, his prophecies were decoded by priestesses from the rustlings of the leaves on his sacred oak trees. Delphi was already the site of a sanctuary of Apollo in the 8th century BCE, and in the Odyssey, Agamemnon is said to have consulted the god Apollo about the expediency of going to war against Troy. Greek myth placed the foundation of the cult centre in the earliest prehistory, though, before even the Olympian males, Zeus and Apollo included, had even taken over the universe. Apollo was believed to have usurped the previous incumbents, Mother Earth and or her daughter, a massive snake or dragon called the Python. Gaining a consultation with Apollo's priestess, the Pythia, was a challenge in itself. She only operated on certain days in the year, and so it was necessary to plan ahead. The climb up the rocky hillside to the sanctuary of Apollo is arduous. And once at Delphi, if the priest couldn't elicit a propitious response from a ram by making it tremble when they sprinkled it with water, then the priestess would not deliver a response. Ritually bathed, the priestess awaited visitors in a rock chamber below the temple into which they descended. And she sat on a tripod, perhaps over a fissure in the floor, or possibly astride equipment under a false floor which allowed smoke or steam to rise. Holding twigs of bay and under the inspiration of Apollo, she theatrically delivered her oracles. Now, it's not clear whether she gave them directly to the questioners herself or whether they were somehow translated into verse riddles by one of the male priests. No convincing evidence has proved any of the rationalising explanations for her trance-like state. These theories are like methane emissions exuded by the rock, oxygen deprivation, narcotics, hypnosis and shamanism. There were Panhellenic cults as well as Panhellenic sanctuaries. Women in nearly every ancient Greek city-state worshipped Dionysus, the wine god, at special festivals outside city walls in the mountains. They dressed as bacchantes in long pleated tunics, dappled fawn skins, with ivy crowns and carrying the ritual thyrsus, a staff made of fennel stalk wreathed with ivy and vines. They drank wine, sang hymns to Dionysus, and danced ecstatically, with distinctive postures in which they nodded up and down and arched their backs. And the myths attached to the Bacchantes' rituals describe murderously savage rites, including murder and cannibalism, but the real-life ritual equivalents are likely to have been more symbolic. In the 4th century BCE, tyrants had taken over Amphissa and installed an army. But a band of Thuiads, which is a special group of Bacchantes from Athens and Delphi, had been worshipping Dionysus on the nearby summits. But they got lost, and this happened a lot. On another occasion, they were snowed in and had to be rescued by mountain rangers. This time, though, they passed out in Amphissa's marketplace, and the more sedate local wives were very concerned that the occupying soldiers would take advantage of their insensible visitors. The women of Amphissa bravely stood all night encircling the Thuiads to guard their sleep. And in the morning they fed them and, after demurely securing permission from their husbands, escorted them in safety to their borders. This inspired Alma Tadema's portentous 1887 painting of this episode. I like his sleepy Thuiads, but I'm relieved to be able to report that the native matrons of Amphissa today look a good deal more cheerful. Individual Greek city-states honoured certain gods and goddesses regarded as particular guardians or protectors of their specific community. On the islands of Cyprus and Lesbos, for example, the cult of Aphrodite was especially important. One poet from Lesbos, Alcaeus, describes beauty competitions between young women held in her honour, and his female counterpart, Sappho, composed beautiful hymns to be sung by women in Aphrodite's honour. And one gives an unparalleled description of the temple of the goddess on Lesbos, and this appeals to all 5 senses. Hither to me from Crete, to this holy temple. Here is your delightful grove of apple trees, your altars smoking with incense. Therein cold water bubbles through apple branches, and the whole place is shadowed by roses. From the shimmering leaves, the sleep of enchantment comes down. Therein too, a meadow where horses graze, blossoms with spring flowers, and the winds blow gently there. Cypress take and pour gracefully into golden cups the nectar that mingles with our festivities. And a later female poet called Gnosis lived in Locri Epizepheri on the eastern shore of the toe of the Italian boot. Her epigrams reveal the psychological world shared by the women in her community. Some describe the dedications made by women in the local temples of goddesses and celebrate, for example, the erotic charms which Aphrodite has bestowed on the celebrants. Another poem begs Artemis, the goddess who oversaw women's biological lives, to aid a woman in the agony of childbirth. And the femininity of the world of Gnosis is very intriguing, because one ancient source suggests that the nobility of Locri, most unusually for a Greek polis, traced their ancestors via the mother's line. And in Gnosis poems, the mother-daughter relationship is paramount. One poem describes the linen mantle woven for Hera by 3 generations of women from the same family, Gnosis, her mother and her grandmother. And another describes a portrait of a little girl called Tharmareta. It says that her female puppy wags her tail at the sight of her mistress's painted face. Spartan women's position in religion was very distinctive. Spartan versions of the great creation myths were curiously matriarchal, giving more important roles to Thetis, the sea goddess, as primordial deity, and to Gaia as mother of the muses. And there were very few female hero cults in ancient Greeks too, but a signal exception was the case of Helen of Sparta. East of Amyclae, in the hills of Therapne rising above the river Eurotas, the Spartans worshipped Agamemnon's brother Menelaus in company with his aberrant wife Helen. And the ruins of the rectangular monument, which can be seen today in its imposing elevated position, date from the 5th century, but it did replace an older shrine. It may have been rebuilt after damage in the earthquake of 464. And a small flask, perhaps containing perfume, was dedicated to Helen there by a man named Dionysus in the 7th century. Some of Helen's offerings are figures of soldiers, perhaps suitable for dedication by men or women hoping for doughty sons, but many are lead or terracotta figurines of animals connected with Helen's role as promoter of fertility. The loom weights and necklaces will have been dedicated by women. Helen in the Iliad is represented as an outstanding weaver of richly pictorial textiles. We've got important written evidence that women felt a strong psychological connection with Helen of Therapne, the embodiment of absolute female allure. Herodotus tells the story of a nurse in charge of an uncommonly plain infant girl. The nurse took remedial action by regularly placing the child before the statue of Helen. And one day, a mysterious woman, perhaps a manifestation of the cult heroine herself, stroked the unfortunate girl's face, announced she would become the most beautiful woman in Sparta. Defying all expectations, she did grow up lovely and married a Spartan king. And partly as a result of Helen's famed erotic reputation, one of the most discussed aspects of the Spartan system was its women. They were usually said to have been allowed far more freedom than other Greek females. Spartan men and women performed athletics, but also challenging sung and danced choruses, in the case of the poet Alcman, involving the memorisation of exquisite lyrics. At festivals of Artemis, women's festivals, older women baked cakes shaped like breasts, and they carried them around as the young unmarried women prepared to sing for the maiden goddess. and the girls' songs celebrate each other's beauty in a homoerotic idiom to prepare them for their eventual sexual partnerships with men. One chorus praises golden-haired Tima Simbrota, another group of beautiful girls who move like the most pedigree fillies, and Hagis Hichora of the lovely ankles, and Asti Meloisa, city singer, who holds a garland like a bright star, has soft hands and glossy hair. But Athens, the only classical Greek city we're in a position to put together substantial details of a full annual calendar of festivals involving women, is Athens. And this is because from the chronological period that we're talking about, we've got far richer literary texts, including drama and law court speeches, as well as art, architecture, material, culture and vases. So let's imagine we're a teenage girl of the citizen class in classical Athens. Let's call her Calliope, lovely horse. And let's think how she would have experienced the Athenian religious calendar. The Athenians were notorious for enjoying so many festivals in each year, perhaps encompassing 80 full days of the year. Besides the important trips further afield to Panhellenic festivals like Olympia, at Athens there were significant festivals in every month for every one of the 12 Olympian gods, except for the war god Ares, and even he was worshipped in a local cult in the largest Attic deme of Akane. Other gods and heroes like Cronus, Rhea, Gaia, Heracles, Theseus and Adonis also received festivals or were honoured within festivals to the major gods. And the most important gods had several festivals under different titles. Now some were for men only, such as those in honour of Hermes and Heracles, but the majority involved women, and Calliope will have looked forward to them eagerly. The Athenian New Year began in mid-July with the month called Hekatombion, and at the end of this month, in approximately mid-August, the most important Athenian week-long festival took place annually, the Panhellenic, with a specially big celebration every 4 years. All citizens and resident foreigners participated in celebrating the birthday of Athena Polias, Athena of the city, whose virginity represented the impregnability of the citadel. The festival began with a splendid procession, a Pompeii, from which we get the English word pomp, and it started at the city walls in the northwest and proceeded slowly into the centre along the Panhellenic Way. It's almost certainly the main topic of the frieze of the Parthenon, because in 432 BCE, the dazzling new temple of Athena, with its Doric columns, friezes and pedamental sculptures, was completed under the supervision of Phidias, who'd also created the massive new gold and ivory statue of Athena Parthenos herself. Standing more than 40 foot high, helmeted, breastplated, holding a shield and a statue of Nike, Victory, encrusted with over 1,000 kilos of golden plate, Phidias' Athena Parthenos is one of the most imposing statues Calliope will ever have seen. And the Parthenon frieze, which runs around the outside surface of the inner building of the temple, represents scenes suggestive of a procession in honour of the goddess housed inside. There are horses and riders, chariots, men bearing musical instruments, water jars and trays, sacrificial animals, a group of 10 important men, probably heroes, seated gods, and a scene involving a male and female official, children and a folded textile. And to the Athenians, the frieze can only have suggested the Panhellenic procession. If Calliope herself was from an aristocratic family, she might well one year have been lucky enough to be chosen as one of the girls chosen to weave a new garment for Athena, with beautiful embroidered scenes of the gods battling the giants. And Athena was herself, of course, the goddess of weaving in her role as Athena Ergane, Athena of handicrafts. But more significantly, weaving was a central duty of the goddess's high priestess. She trained these teenage girl attendants who officiated in the cult, including the 2 specially selected highborn girls, and they lived with her on the Acropolis for the whole 9 months leading up to the Panhellenic. And these 2 girls, called by the cult title Arepharoi, had to weave the new gown for the goddess's statue and to supervise 11 younger girls who helped them in this arduous task. When they reached the Acropolis, they placed this fabulous textile on the statue of Athena. The Great Panhellenic, held every 4 years, must have lasted a week, at least, since it involved athletics competitions, equestrian and musical events, a torch race, a boat race, lavish sacrifices, feasting and an all-night celebration. But the girls like Calliope, who carried the gown for the goddess, led the procession, followed by the priestesses of Athena and Athenian women carrying gifts. Further back, there were cows and sheep, resident aliens with their wives and daughters carrying portable stools, musicians, chariots, cavalry, and another group of women weavers, the Augustinae, as well as male citizens. Athenian women therefore constituted a very large section. Sacrifices were made en route, for example, at the temple of Athena Nike, goddess of victory, no doubt led by the special priestess who officiated in that particular cult. And then the procession entered the Erechtheum, and Calliope and the other girls placed the gown they'd woven on an ancient life-size wooden statue of Athena Polias. The much larger gown was taken to and bestowed upon the vast statue of Athena Parthenos in the Parthenon itself. So the importance of women, both girls and mature priestesses, in these ceremonies simply can't be overestimated. The priestess of Athena was indeed by far the most powerful woman in the city. She was expected to show leadership and courage in defence of the Acropolis. When Cleomenes the Spartan climbed the Acropolis in order to seize it in 506, he really hadn't expected that a lone woman would stand up to him. But Herodotus reports that when he tried to enter the temple of Athena, the priestess rose from her chair to prevent him entering. And she declared, "Spartan stranger, go back, do not enter this holy place. No Dorian is permitted to go in." And in the event, Cleomenes did have to depart altogether just 2 days later. The priestesshood of Athena Polias was a really important public office, held for life, and the incumbent was traditionally supplied by one of the oldest and most respected families in Athens, the Aetioboutadae. We have some information about another woman who held the same office later. In one of the most fascinating discoveries of the mid-20th century, an inscription was deciphered that allowed us to discover the identity of the woman who was priestess at the time that Aristophanes' famous comedy Lysistrata was first produced in 411 BCE. The astonishing possibility emerged that Lysistrata was directly modelled on a real woman, the priestess of Athena in 411, whose name was Lysimache. Now, she had a brother who also held public office, and his name was Lysicles. And according to a much later source, the Roman elder Pliny, this Lysimache held office for 64 years. Lysistrata means the woman who disbands the army, and Lysimache means something very similar, the woman who puts a stop to the fighting. It seems almost impossible that the original audience of Lysistrata wouldn't have made the connection between their most important priestess's name and that of Aristophanes' revolutionary new heroine. And there are strong parallels between Lysistrata and the role of the priestess of Athena Polias. The priestess had a residence on the Acropolis, and she couldn't be married. Could this be why Lysistrata never seems to speak specifically of a husband or children or household of her own, and she's far less sex-obsessed than the other women? The priestess of Athena had the duty of organising the preparation of sacred banquets, and Lysistrata invites the Athenian and Spartan negotiators into a ritual meal to ratify their treaty. Like the priestess of Athena, who nearly a century before had stood up to the Spartan invaders, Lysistrata is totally fearless in the face of male violence. She is not afraid of the men attacking the barricaded Acropolis. She wards off the thuggish guards sent to arrest her. And like Athena in a Homeric battle, she utters the battle cry to bring the battalions of women out of the Acropolis. The priestess of Athena also had an unusual degree of public power. Unlike other women, such as our Calliope, she could take men to court and be charged with offences herself. So it's interesting, therefore, to find that Lysistrata is named out loud and in public in front of and by men without losing any dignity or respectability. Citizen women would normally be ashamed to be named in public. She's also an expert at weaving, as she shows in the extended metaphor by which she conceives of organising and administering the city-state as a process of textile production, the weaving of a cloak. And it's significant that her chorus remember fulfilling the role of Arepharos in their younger days. Her command of ritual is impressive, as would of course befit the high priestess of Athena. She leads the discussion about the correct procedures for conducting sacrifices. She performs a natural libation to the goddess Persuasion, leads the solemn oath-taking scene, has access to and herself recites the bird oracle, and orchestrates and directs the hymn singing at the end, including the Spartans' hymn to Spartan Athena. It's also possible that the selection of the name of one of her chief accomplices, Myrine, is a reference to the name of one of the real Lysimachus staff on the Acropolis. An epitaph tells us that a woman named Myrine was a priestess of Athena Nike, victorious Athena, whose little temple was added to the Acropolis buildings under the Periclean building programme. There are other references in the play to the cult and rituals of Athena Polias. The third woman who tries to escape from the Acropolis has put a helmet under her costume in order to appear pregnant. And this is, of course, the helmet famously associated in art with Athena. We also hear of the owls, Athena's birds, who live on the Acropolis, but keep the fourth escapee awake at night. Indeed, if Lysistrata shares many features with Lysimache, the priestess of Athena Polias, by the end of the play, her persona seems to merge just as much with the actual goddess herself. In the fantastic version of Athens that we're watching, the heroine can virtually turn into her patron goddess. In a remarkable scene, it transpires that she possesses the ability to summon into the theatre an entirely supernatural being, the personification of reconciliation. And the chorus now speaks of Lysistrata in such honorific terms that it's almost as if she's turned into Athena on stage herself. The second month of the year featured a festival for the goddess Demeter, in which Athenian women must have participated. But we know far more about the much more important harvest time festival for both Demeter and her daughter Persephone, held in the third month, Boedromion, late September to early October. And here women played roles as priestesses as well as initiates. And they included the high priestess of Demeter, or priestess of Demeter and Chore, the maiden, an office inherited within two prestigious families. There was an additional priestess torchbearer who worked alongside male torchbearers. And two other married females served Demeter and Persephone respectively. And there was a group of priestesses called the Holy Ones, or the Bees, Melissae. They're mentioned in some of the later sources. And the sensual rituals took place at Eleusis, near the coast of northwestern Attica. But the festival began with another splendid Pompeii procession, this one being of more than 13 miles, all the way from the city centre to the cult centre. Everyone initiated in the mysteries who was going to be initiated joined this procession. And since initiation was available to everyone who spoke Greek, including slaves, there must have been a high proportion of women, including girls like Calliope, proceeding alongside their fellow initiates, or mustai. On the 14th day of the month, the festival started. Certain sacred objects were brought from Eleusis to the Eleusinion underneath the Acropolis of Athens. And the next day, all these priests and priestesses gathered, declared the festival open, and they sacrificed. Pigs especially are associated with the cult of Demeter. On the third day, some of the initiates bathed in the sea at the old Athenian harbour of Phalerum. They sacrificed at home and held a domestic feast that lasted all night. The procession proper began on the 18th. Calliope will have waved her Bacchic staff and engaged in ribald jokes to pass the time on the long walk. The jokes were in honour of an old woman named Iambe, who was said in the great hymn to Demeter to have made Demeter laugh with her dirty jokes. When they arrived at Eleusis, there was another all-night vigil, perhaps acting out or representing our Demeter's search for Persephone after her abduction. This myth had special importance for mothers and daughters and celebrated the bond between them that cannot be broken by either death or marriage. The next day, initiates entered a hall called the Telesterion after confirming they had fasted and also drunk a possibly psychotropic beverage made from barley and done things with mysterious objects inside a special box. The rites represented the myth of the abduction from Persephone from her mother Demeter by the king of the underworld, Hades, and that was done in a cycle of 3 phases: the descent or loss, the quest or search, and the ascent, with Persephone's joyous reunion with her mother. And the assurance of fertility in the arable fields was guaranteed in a ritual involving the bestowal of a wheat sheaf on a young man named Triptolemus, to whom Demeter was said to have gifted the science of agriculture. And Demeter's priestesses must have played a crucial role in these enactments. At Eleusis, events were actually dated by the name of the reigning high priestess. Now, sadly for us, these rituals were designed to be so secret that we know very little detail. The penalties for divulging them were very severe. There were certainly ritual acts and recitations led by the priests and priestesses, followed by yet another all-night feast. There were dances held to celebrate crops, a bull sacrifice at which women will have raised the ritual cry at the shedding of blood and honoured the dead with their libations. The initiates believed they were guaranteed a blissful afterlife, and then on the 23rd, everyone went home. But the women of Athens needed to recover their religious energies quickly, because the most important women-only fertility festival, the Thesmophoria, also on honour of Demeter and her daughter Persephone, was held in the very next month, Panhellenic, around early November. And actually we know a good deal about this festival from Aristophanes' comedy Thesmophoriad set at the festival itself. Calliope will only have been allowed to attend after her marriage, but all Athenian wives were expected to attend. And this 3-day festival saw the women camp out alone in the sanctuary called the Thesmophorion. On day 1, they ascended to the hillside sanctuary and put up tents. Women and their slaves from the same extended household would share a tent. 2 women were elected to be in charge of this women-only festival. Piglets were sacrificed, thrown into a trench as a symbol of soil fertilisation. On day 2, the women fasted, symbolically reenacting the famine which Demeter inflicted when her daughter was abducted. And the women held council, perhaps seated on very special plants, and engaged in exchanging ritual obscenities. The 3rd day was called Kalligeneia, or Day of the Beautiful Birth, and the women prayed for their own fertility. Right at the end of this month, the priestesses of Athena once again came to the fore at the formal setting up on the festival day of Athena and Hephaestus as technology gods, the formal setting up of the loom on which Athena's new gown would be woven for the Panhellenic 9 months later. But the main religious event in which women participated in this next month, Mimacterion, was a much grimmer affair. Calliope is highly likely to have had a grandfather, father, uncle or brother who fought in the Athenian army in the Athenian colonial wars abroad, and almost inevitably, at some point in her life, she'll have lost one of her menfolk in combat. So she'll have been accustomed to attending the Athenian state funeral in the winter month of Mimacterion. This is one of the very few occasions on which Athenian women were directly addressed in a public civic venue by a politician. The Athenians gathered annually at the city's beautiful burial ground to lay coffins in the earth for the dead of each civic tribe and listen to a speech in their praise. The important point was that this funeral ceremony was administered by the state. All the men killed in action were buried together without distinction according to rank. Rich families were prohibited from using the occasion of a family funeral to show off their wealth to the poorer bereaved. The ceremonies were organised by the state magistrate in charge of the military, the Polemarch. The soldiers' bones were carefully gathered up from the funeral pyre where the bodies were consumed, and they were brought home from abroad to the city, and there for 3 days before the interment, the bones lay in state beneath tents of honour to receive the votive offerings from friends and relatives: flowers, weapons, precious ornaments, painted vases. There were 10 coffins of funereal cypress, one for each tribe, and an 11th, an empty one, in memory of the unrecognised, but not therefore honoured, the coffin of the unknown soldiers. On the 4th day, the mournful procession was formed. Mothers, wives, sisters and daughters led the way, the males following, and a leading public figure delivered the oration. Thucydides has recorded the gist of what Pericles said at the state funeral in 431. After addressing all the bereaved at the end, he divides them into 3 groups to deliver individual pieces of advice. He acknowledges the pain of the parents of the dead, especially when they see other parents whose sons are still alive. But he says there's an answer, at least for those still young enough to bear more children. This reads rather brutally to our 21st century ears. He says, not only will the children who may hereafter be born make them forget their own lost ones, but the city will be doubly a gainer. She will not be left desolate, and she will be safer. To the sons and brothers of the dead, he acknowledges that emulating the dead heroes will be arduous, but the good thing about being dead, if the death was glorious, is freedom from the criticism and detraction of rivals. But to the widows, he's notoriously blunt and unsympathetic. If I am to speak of womanly virtues to those of you who will henceforth be widows, let me sum them up in one short admonition. To a woman not to show more weakness than is natural to her sex is a great glory, and to be mentioned little as possible amongst men, either in praise or blame. Just what's going on here? Why did Pericles feel the need to say this? How much did the bereaved women of Athens complain about their plight? Is he simply reminding the quiet and docile female population to remain quiet and docile, or is he actually forced to mention these women because he's faced with a militant, distraught and noisy group of ritual mourners, grandmothers, wives, sisters, daughters, who are going to make life difficult for politicians who advocate war? We don't know. A festival in which women were more prominent than men occurred in the next month, Haloa, December to January, and the Haloa took its name from the threshing floor. It was held in honour of Demeter, Dionysus and Poseidon, so bread, wine and fish. The big theme of the next month, Gamelion, was marriage. It was a very fashionable month for weddings. Women featured prominently in marriage rituals, with the mother of the bride formally escorting her daughter, holding a torch aloft to her new home with her husband's family. It was thought to be a day when it was important to treat women with the greatest respect. One of Theophrastus' studies of commonly encountered personality types in his characters is the Touchless Man. And his fault is not that he likes to perform conventional rants against the female sex, but that he tactlessly performs them at weddings. On the 27th of Gamelion, the Athenians reenacted the marriage of Zeus and Hera with the most lavish of banquets, attended by both sexes to herald the imminence of spring. And marriage was still on the Athenians' minds in the ensuing month, when the important festival of the Antisteria put the wine god Dionysus at the centre of a festival. And the emphasis was very much on the nuclear family. The central ritual was the celebration of the marriage of Dionysus to Ariadne, represented by the Archon Basileus and his real-life wife, the Basilina, and sexual intercourse seems to have been involved. The ritual queen was, however, chaperoned by a group of senior Athenian matrons, the Gerarai, who were sworn to secrecy. But this very drunken festival also featured tiny children prominently. Dozens of vases portrayed children at the Antisteria, crawling, toddling, playing, acting out ritual stories, and young mums and dads seem to have enjoyed these child-centred rituals enormously. But the most important festival of Dionysus was the city Dionysia, held in late March or early April. The highlight was the drama competitions, which were largely an all-male affair. But the festival opened with a procession which defined, by symbolic enactment, the relationships between the groups that made up Athenian society. And, as ever, women were central to this symbolism. The procession was actually led by a virginal young woman from an aristocratic family who carried the ceremonial golden basket that contained the choicest of pieces of meat from the sacrifice later in the ceremony. Near the back of the procession, enormous loaves of bread on splits and wine in leather skins were carried by citizens, while the resident aliens brought bowls for mixing the wine with water, borne in pitchers by their daughters. And while there could have been little room in the theatre for women other than the priestess of Athena, there were smaller festivals of Dionysus all over the country villages of Attica, where in due course plays began to be performed and revived, and local women certainly had access to these local shows. The great public festivals for Artemis, goddess of menstruation and childbirth, were especially dear to women. There was an all-night feast for Artemis at the Tower of Polis. There, women could themselves hire female musicians to entertain their female parties. And Brauron was the scene of the boisterous Brauronia, celebrated every 4 years and much enjoyed by men as well as women. Girls who'd started their periods underwent initiation ceremonies called the Arctia. These involved saffron-coloured dresses and the imitation of bear cubs. The sanctuary at Brauron was easily one of the most important in Attica. The discovery there of not only dozens of statues of children, but hundreds of little 5th century dishes called krateriskoi, which show girls running or dancing, has enhanced our picture of the rituals there. And the connection with bears is particularly interesting, since bears feature in other cultures, especially Native American tribes, in connection with menstruation. And Brauron's also crammed with those relief sculptures dedicated by women who'd led a family sacrifice, showing them with their children and husbands, sometimes holding up small babies to the goddess in a gesture of pride and gratitude. On a sadder note, the clothing of women who died in childbirth was dedicated to Iphigenia at Brauron. Death of women in childbirth was a trauma frequently suffered by ancient Greek families, and there must have been rituals designed to address it. We do have wonderfully detailed lists of garments dedicated to Artemis at Brauron in the 4th century. These inscriptions commemorate and celebrate the names, the possessions, and, by implication, the skills and status of the female dedicants, including one called Calliope, which is where I got the name from. The details of the clothes still have a concentrated sensory power. Tunics, veils, scarves, belts. They're sleeved, patterned, decorated with coloured borders and variegated threads. They're purple, white, frog green and saffron yellow. They're dedicated alongside combs and hairnets, bobbins and spindle whorls by women called Calliope, Archippe, Charippe, Phidilla, Cleo and Tesicratea. It's some of the most important evidence in existence for ancient Greek clothing. There are no fewer than 271 items, 32 types of garment and 81 descriptive items. The Artemis cult at Brauron seems to have operated at the very intersection of public and private religion. And women, at home in their households, were deeply involved in domestic rites of passage, including childbirth. Families and midwives sacrificed to childbirth goddesses, including Artemis and Eileithyia. There was a ceremony on the 10th day after the birth, and after that, parturient women were allowed out of quarantine and the private female world of the childbirth was opened up to menfolk. The domestic ceremony involved the father running naked around the hearth with the newborn in his arms and acknowledging it as his, followed by choral dancing by all the women of the family. In a private funeral, under normal conditions, women also played crucial roles. It was their duty to bathe, perfume and dress the corpse in white before displaying it on a couch to other friends and relatives. The funeral itself, which was called the ekphora, or carrying out, took place the next day, usually soon after dawn. The people in the mourning procession that accompanied the bier wore dark clothes and sometimes cut their hair or shaved their heads. The men traditionally led the way, and the women tore their hair and beat their breasts in the rear, singing traditional dirges. The funeral was followed by a private family meal and further ritual visits to the tomb on the 3rd, 9th and 30th days after interment. Women could also take the initiative in organising more fun and less formal religious celebrations. In a comedy by Menander called the Douskalos, Socrates' mother is only inspired to organise a sacrifice after being visited by Pan in a dream. So she leads a family picnic to a cave believed to be inhabited by him and the nymphs in the rural deme of Phyle. The celebration includes all the standard features of large public festivals: sacrificial meal, drinking and dancing that goes on into the night. And the extraordinary festival of the Adonai, held in early or midsummer, was celebrated by women privately. And this was Aphrodite's big moment in the Athenian calendar. And the emphasis was on women's sexuality and fertility. The occasion was supposed to mark and mourn the death of gorgeous young Adonis, Aphrodite's lover. Women of all backgrounds, from secluded aristocratic wives to street-walking prostitutes, celebrated the Adonai. They all took to the rooftops and sang and danced ritual choruses to lament Adonis, also called Sabadzios. They put flower pots on these roofs and planted in what they called gardens of Adonis, lettuce and fennel and other seeds and cuttings. And they watered them in decidedly phallic rituals. At the climax, they descended to the streets with small replica images of Adonis, enacted a mock funeral procession, and then buried the images at sea or in fountains and rivers. So the Adonai rituals, non-official and not state-sanctioned occasions, these were viewed as occurring on the very margins of civic culture during the classical period. The rituals that took place, although performed exclusively by women, were so noisy that they made a huge impression on Aristophanes' audience. In Lysistrata, the magistrate assumes that the takeover of the Acropolis by the women is connected with their Adonis cult. On his arrival, he says, "Has there been another outburst of the women's debauchery? The drumming and the non-stop cries of Sabadzios and all that moaning on the rooftops for Adonis? I once heard all of that when I was in the assembly." And he specifies the occasion when the drunken carousing and lewd songs for Adonis could be heard during the debate over the Sicilian expedition. But there was a corrective to the Adonai and its female lubricity. The calendar year ended with the festival of the Skyra, or Skyrophoria. Athena's priestess and the priest of Poseidon led a procession to a place called Skyron near Eleusis and conducted ceremonies under a very special canopy. The men played games of dice, while women roamed off together in groups and ate garlic in a symbolic repudiation, for the time being, of sex with men. And the Skyra is the very credible setting for the female revolution staged in Aristophanes' comedy Women at the Assembly. So, we followed Calliope through a whole calendar year. She's been weaving for Athena, dancing in ribald procession to Eleusis, weeping over dead warriors, delighting with Dionysus and Artemis and babies and toddlers. She's waved and watered her phallic plants to stimulate her own desire, and she's put men off deliberately by eating garlic. We've seen how prominent and active women were in Athenian civic religion. There was no month in which women did not have a major festival or event to attend, and in several they celebrated entirely alone with no male supervision at all. I truly wish that the great monotheisms of today had anything like as much agency, beauty and sheer good fun to offer women today. Thank you.